issue. Before you give any question or discussions, please let us know your name and affiliations and to whom your question is going. So let's start. Oh yeah, please. Thank you.
Yes, my name is Jim Dingman. I'm from Pacifica Radio. I have two questions to the panel as a whole. There's a different way, of course, to look at what happened yesterday in Korea, and that is if one puts in the dynamics of the presidential race, the volatility of domestic politics in the United States. Last Sunday, the image that was seen by the world was of a young Salvadoran male and his child drowned in the Rio Grande. And Trump, of course, is a master of imagery and spectacle. Some, of course, look on his presidency domestically as a continual soap opera. So one could see perhaps that, oh, let's take the photo op of going to the DMZ to throw the attention of domestic opinion to a different issue. So I wonder what you think about that. Secondly, the issue of the discussion about Iran versus Korea. Because as you know, Pompeo made a statement in April where he essentially said to Iran, you have to disarm. We're not talking about a tinderbox, we're talking about low-level fires going on in the Middle East with Yemen, with Syria, with Iraq, with the Gaza-Israel-Palestine issue. A very different situation, but one perhaps that Trump may think, I have my model of dealing with Kim Jong-un, let me try to do the same thing with the Iranians, of course, differently because he essentially asked them to negate their entire foreign policy since the revolution. So how do you see those interact?
He raised I think he raised two issues, and who will answer the first? You want to answer first?
Sure, so thanks for your question. I think the broader, if I can expand that out a little bit, I think the core of your concern is to what extent was the third U.S. DPRK summit an attempt to shift the news cycle away from not only the situation on the U.S. border, but also the general anxieties in June in the Persian Gulf, for example. So I think there's fairly good body balance over the weekend. President Trump made multiple references during his tour of the DMZ to the press that the press doesn't talk about what he's doing with North Korea. When he was in the room with Kim Jong-un, he actually looked at Kim and he said, by coming here today, you made the both of us look good. So I certainly think that that is part of the president's calculation in entering this round of diplomacy, because whether we like it or not, I think we've seen a cycle of pessimism and optimism over the last year. I'll point to a few examples. The pessimism that had set in after the Panmunjom Declaration in May 2018, after the cancellation by President Trump, was quickly replaced by optimism after Singapore, which quickly again gave way to pessimism in July and August after Mike Pompeo's trip, and eventually his canceled trip in August, again replaced by optimism in September 2018 with the Inter-Korean Agreement. Followed again by pessimism after Kim Yong-chol cancels his trip to Washington, D.C. in January with a vegan speech. So there are these cycles, and I think the president has appreciated that every time he does meet with Kim Jong-un, the cycle really changes, and it really does cause that inflection of optimism that distracts from domestic and foreign anxieties elsewhere for the United States. So my assessment will be that that's fairly accurate.
Okay, second one is going to be your turn.
Yeah, firstly, let me say, of course, it was a spectacle on the DMZ. The issue is not whether it was a spectacle, it was what's going to be. It's whether anything useful came out of it. What appears to have come out of it is a commitment to actually have a working level talks. And you're never going to get anywhere without that. We've actually now got to the point we should have got to in Hanoi before John Bolton, if you want, wrecked the whole thing with his definition of denuclearization, which we can spend a lot of time on. Iran, Trump is doing different things to different audiences. It's always difficult for me because I'm actually trying to say that the way forward is to solve the North Korean crisis is a mixture of Iran and the agreed framework. President Trump is against Iran and he's against repeating the mistakes of the past. The agreed framework actually effectively froze North Korea's nuclear program for a short decade. It seemed to be actually a rather good success before it was unilaterally abandoned by President Bush. Now, I'm a member of the British Labour Party. I'm still active in the Labour Party. I voted for Jeremy Corbyn twice. And I can't think, as I said to Ri So-young in Pyongyang, of a single thing I agree with Donald Trump doing, apart from his dealings with North Korea. And one of the things that worries me greatly is that the Democrats in Congress are going to do what the Republicans did to the agreed framework and essentially wreck it in the interest of domestic politics.
First,
Well, I know I haven't
about the Iranian agreement.
Well, no, I think it's the, but I fully agree also on Trump there, but as I said, the only thing that matters is really would we use it. And the reasons he actually made this opportunity, I'll accept everything as long as it has a positive impact. And I think it has a positive impact, regardless if you want it or not. So.
Okay, let's go to the second question.
Okay, my name is John Contra. I'm a political historian and I take the long view. Listening to this discussion, the lack of a common definition of denuclearization suggests that it's a metaphor for the intractable nature of the Korean conflict, which is at its core a political conflict. And what came through my mind was going back to 1945 and the Moscow Conference and the banner headlines that came out of it. Big Three agree on Korea unity. Well, that was fine for a banner headline, but what later transpired was there was no common definition of a trusteeship under which this was going to take place. The Americans had one conception of an open peninsula, and the Russians had a different conception of a friendly provisional government. And the negotiations broke down, and there were two Koreas as a result. So I think what I want to suggest is that this lack of a common definition on denuclearization goes beyond just denuclearization. We also have to take into consideration what steps the North Koreans may be expecting the U.S. to take in terms of its in terms of its military presence on the peninsula. The restructuring of it would inevitably come into play. Some commentators suggest that everything could remain the same. Keep the UN command, but we replace the armistice. That, to me, seems to be an oxymoron. So perhaps you want to respond to that critique.
Thank you too for your comment. And we're going to take another questions or discussion from you.
Sure, this is Charles Yoon. Actually, my question is very similar to the prior questioner. Listening to the fact that there was no meeting of minds in the definition of denuclearization. So on the one hand, you have complete, verifiable dismantling of all weapons, and that's pretty clear what that is. On the other hand, is North Korea wants to be free of any nuclear threat, which is possible because the United States would hit North Korea with a nuclear weapon at any time, and that capacity is never going to go away. So it almost seems that from a very start, definitionally, we're at a point where we really can't come to some sort of agreement. So given that, I wonder, so that seems to be sort of a troubling sort of lack of first step that we're able to take. On the other hand, there does seem to be, a genuine desire on the part of all the world leaders to ramp down the level of potential violence and come to some sort of agreement. So is the nuclearization framework the wrong framework to work in? If we can never come to a joint definition, and if somebody had a definition that worked, we would have come up with it by now. It seems like there is none. So is there some other format that we should be following?
Thank you. Oh, I think Ankit, you might have something to say about the definition of denuclearization.
Yeah, I'm sure the other panelists might want to chime in here too, but I'll just begin by saying, so on the second question, I think that really gets to the crux of the issue on why the approach in Hanoi was really, I think, doomed to failure from the start. The approach that I think at least we've heard John Bolton and Stephen Deegan talk about is that right now we want the North Koreans to agree to a process A to Z, where Z is denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula, and A through Y are the steps that we take to get there. But of course, as you pointed out, defining the absence of a U.S. nuclear threat is something the United States is never going to agree to, right? Even if the North Koreans came up and told us, wrote down on a piece of paper, get rid of your ICBMs, your SLBMs, and your entire nuclear forces, disarm unilaterally, that would never happen, even if it's a U.S. obligation under Article 6 of the NPT, which the North Koreans sometimes always talk about. So then, what is the prescription? And I think the prescription then is to really begin with the approach that President Moon has really favored, which is to proceed step by step. Instead of worrying about A through Y in one go, coming to a summit and really working at that roadmap. When we know that we won't agree to a definition on what Z is, you start doing A, B, and C. You build trust, you build confidence, and then you work onto D, E, F, multiple steps. And eventually you work down that long road. You know, the North Koreans have said in the past to American negotiators, which I think really gets at the crux of how they see denuclearization. You know, during the six-party talks, Kim Jong-il's negotiators told their American counterparts that Kim Il-sung's dying wish was the denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula. And last year in March, when the South Korean National Security Advisor went to Pyongyang, right before the Singapore summit was announced in Washington, Kim Jong-un reportedly also told him that Kim Jong-il's dying wish was the denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula. So where am I getting at here? I think I fully believe that Kim Jong-un's dying wish will also be the denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula. But the lesson then is to use that, I think, quite apt insight that getting to this definition is going to be very difficult, to begin a step-by-step process that doesn't get hold of based on it.
Can I take a two-finger?
Oh, yes.
Two-finger.
Hey, Joe, the line starts back here.
Two-finger. One, two. Two-finger, right? Two-finger. Let me just say this. You know, in the six-party talks, we had definition.
Yeah.
Right?
Yes.
It was dismantlement of all nuclear weapons and nuclear weapons facilities, right? It was clarity. There's no ambiguity. The joint statement of September 19, 2005 is clear. And that was the negotiators spending 2 years plus saying, what is the definition? What are we talking about? So what we're talking about now is, I think, and Glenn, you mentioned this in passing, I think I did, and Charles and others, is the DMZ meeting said the negotiators can now meet and talk about denuclearization. Talk about what are we talking about, because if we can't define what we're talking about, we may never get to the end goal. So I think the Korean people, the American people, all people, certainly those involved in the six-party talks, Russia, China, Japan, indeed the European Union, Cato, Australians, all deserve to understand that, and that's been denied because the negotiators haven't sat down and talked about the basics. We got the basics in the six-party talks, and we said this is the basics, and this is what we're working towards. Because North Korea has a lot of requirements on their part, correctly so. So we need to hear the basics. What is the definition of complete denuclearization? That's in the Singapore joint statement. What does that mean? Does it mean the troops in South Korea? Does it mean the extended nuclear deterrence commitments the U.S. provides to not only the Republic of Korea, but the government of Japan? What are we talking? How do we measure it? We will not know that until the negotiators sit down, and then we have an obligation to ask those negotiators and our leaders to come forth and say, explain these things, because this touches all the people. Because if we stumble into conflict, it affects everyone, right? It just doesn't affect the leadership. So everyone has a right to know that. So I guess my simple answer is, we understood that in the six-party talks, we had negotiators negotiating. If we can have negotiators negotiating now, we'll get to that issue very quickly and determine if there's a path to that so-called roadmap and timelines to get there. Because in fact, if there is such a divergent view, we may not be able to get there. And then we'd have to go, what is plan B? How do the leaderships get together? That was my 2 things.
Oh, thank you. This discussion getting hot, so we have discussions behind.
저는 한국 건국대학교 철학과의 김성민 교수입니다. 니크라스 스완스톰 박사에게 질문하겠습니다. 그 다자간 체제, 다자간 협의, 그레이터의 뜻을 강조하셨는데 제가 보기에는 그것은 자칫하면 우리의 형식 논리에 빠질 수가 있다. 사자간이든 육자간이든 대단히 수평적인 것이라고 우리가 인식할 수 있지만 내용적으로는 그렇지 않다는 말씀을 드리고자 합니다. 정말 불행하게도 우리가 이제 한반도 평화체제를 얘기할 때는 남과 북만의 문제가 아닌 이것은 바로 동북아 문제이기도 하고 이것이 바로 평화로 대체세계 평화로 나아가는데 20세기를 보면 전반부는 제1, 2차 세계대전을 겪으면서 전쟁의 시대였다라고 한다면 후반부는 냉전의 시대다. 이거는 전쟁의 잠복 시대다라고 할 수 있는데 그것이 바로 한반도가 그런 점이라는 게 대단히 가슴 아픈 일이라고 생각합니다. 제가 드리고자 하는 말씀은 우리가 1991년 노태우 대통령 시절 이후에 어찌됐든 소련과 중국과 소위 남방 삼각이라고 하는 그 체제에서 수교를 하면서 일정 정도 관계를 회복했다고 생각을 합니다. 그러나 이런 한국과 소련, 부소련, 러시아의 관계 회복이 되었는데 소위 말해서 북방 삼각, 북중로의 관계 속에서 지금 현재 미국과 일본, 미국과 북한의 관계가 저는 단건이라고 생각을 합니다. 특히나 핵 문제와 관련해서 미국과 북한이 이 관계 체제가 평화적으로 나가는 것이 대단히 중요하다고 생각하는데 그렇게 본다면 수평적으로는 다자간 협의 체제라고 하지만 결국은 북한과 일본, 북한과 미국과의 관계가 사실은 지금 먼저 풀어야 할 문제다라고 하는 생각을 합니다. 따라서 우리가 다자간 협의 체제라고 하는 다자간 시스템이라고 하는 것은 대단히 듣기에는 수평적인 것 같지만 내용적으로는 이러한 국제적인 역학 관계 속에 있기 때문에 우리가 먼저 풀어야 할 문제는 북미 간의 관계라는 생각입니다.
Okay, 니크라스, it's your turn.
Well, of course, the bilateral relations are important between the United States and EPRK. On the other hand, it's extremely difficult to implement a lot of these measures without a multilateral setting. And we talk about world peace and all of that, but there is a risk that the Korean Peninsula is hijacked by other issues as well. It's a geopolitical issue. The US-China tension, let's assume that the relation of the United States and China becomes worse. Then it's extremely unlikely that you'll see cooperation between the United States and China over the Korean Peninsula. And I think that's a fact. Because we have national interest. National interest is the primary driver. So for me, it is important to bring in that sort of multilateral aspect. Is that excluding the bilateral setting? Absolutely not. I mean, the bilateral negotiations between the United States and the EPRK is still going to be the single most important. But it is also to give other actors a seat at the table. Most notably, of course, China in this case. And I see no reason why China should support a process where they're excluded from it. And I don't actually see any reason why Europe should do it either, in the end of the day. So, for me, it is national interest that is running. The national interest needs to come into this equation. So, I agree with you that the bilateral setting is incredibly interesting, quite relevant, but you do need to bring in other states' interest as well. But then actually, can I just comment on this? I think there is a different, if the denuclearization framework is a wrong approach, I would like to see a broader approach. And the Helsinki process as one example, when you have different baskets, when you get stuck on one, you move to the next one, you just start looking at this in a broader way. I know the North Koreans is terribly against this, but I think that was very successful between, even if the primary actors were the United States and the Soviet Union, Europeans had a stake in this, which was comforting for the Europeans. The problem we have here is what is the value of the different steps today? when the United States and ROK gave out the military exercises, the North Koreans said, yeah, this is worth nothing. This is the first step. This is for free. Of course, that was not the perception of the United States and ROK. So we need to find what the value of the different steps, and if you can trade baskets against baskets. But yeah, I would like to see a much broader approach.
Grant has also some response to it.
Oh, yeah, I just want to, we need to understand what's actually happened. Hanoi had a situation where Kim Jong-un was faced with what you might term transitional demands. The demands on him were impossible for him to implement and survive as a leader in North Korea. That led to a debate going on inside the party between the people in favour of engagement and those and the Conservatives. And if you were reading the Royal Shimon, the danger was that that was getting out of hand because the people who appeared to be coming out on top were the Conservatives, who were saying the best form of military deterrent, the best way to prevent war is military strength, and that we should not allow our system to be led by a hegemonic power from outside. President Xi came in very heavily and actually effectively backed the pro-engagement people by telling them that he had their back and that maximum pressure was not going to be allowed to work, that the interpretation and implementation of the sanctions regime will be such that they will be able to survive. The result of that was that in Washington they woke up to the fact that unless they went back to the status quo ante before the second day of Hanoi, they were going to be out of the game. And so President Trump went and kick-started that process at the DMZ, and we've gone back to where we should have been in Hanoi, which is to have working level negotiations to deal with all the issues about definition and the rest. Last point, actually they were interested in the Helsinki process 2 or 3 years ago. I mean, so there has been some discussion, but the danger of the Helsinki process, you've got to decide at both ends what are your priorities, because the US would not want an easing of North Korean human rights, but North Korea's keeping their nuclear weapons. That would not be seen as a success.
Okay, Teresa, you have one more person before you, so you better wait or ready for that. Okay, yeah, there are two gentlemen before you.
I'm going to sit down.
Okay, sorry.
And it's actually a
Teresa, would you?
It's actually a statement.
Okay, go ahead.
I think that the nuclear issue started. Someone was asking a question about history, so let's go back to history. The United States had 950 tactical nuclear weapons in South Korea at one point. You can go to the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists and you can find a breakdown by type of weapon. We made a declaration we were just going to ignore the provision of the armistice, and we introduced these things. So I think the basic dynamic is not an evil regime, although you could argue maybe some of that. The basic dynamic is an action-reaction dynamic. Now that's fallen out of favor with IR people. Everything is a system. But that's the basic dynamic. We did something, they responded. And with Trump too, it's the same dynamic. He gave Kim Jong-un the New York City schmooze treatment. And the guy had never encountered anything like that. And he kind of liked it. Okay, so that's one point. We started this thing. Okay? The other thing is that, in my opinion, nuclear weapons are there not just for the United States. North Korea has another problem. We haven't talked anything about China today. And to the extent that nuclear weapons are something that weak countries acquire because they feel threatened existentially, North Korea has another big threat on its northern border, which is the PRC. Right now it's friendly, and I agree with the statement that was just made by Glenn. about why the North Koreans perhaps came along, because the Chinese said that they were going to loosen their sanctions on the North, and they had their back. I think that's absolutely right. But it isn't all about us. And there's a second reason why North Korea has nuclear weapons. And by the way, there was a third for a while when South Korea had its nuclear weapons program as well, until it ended when we sat on them and told them to stop it. So these are all factors in a very complex situation. Thank you.
Okay, Charles, go ahead. You go ahead.
Okay. Yes, I'll be very brief. There is a chance. I will ask a question to Professor Tang, since he has not had any questions. I think your analysis is very interesting, but I would suggest you have a kind of liberal bias. Vladimir Putin told us last week at the G20 that the age of liberalism is over. In other words, North Korea may see that authoritarian capitalism works, and that system can be maintained for a very long, indefinite period of time. So do you think that it is possible that North Korea is moving toward a kind of authoritarian capitalism, not just on the Chinese model, but there are many examples out there. Central Asia, Kazakhstan, Turkmenistan. It's not just China and Vietnam as possible models. And if North Korea is moving toward a long-term kind of sustainable model of authoritarian capitalism, what does that mean for the possible integration and unification of two Koreas?
Okay, Tuition, go ahead. After we hear all those discussions, and then we answer.
Yes. So we were discussing before quite a bit about definition of denuclearization, but to some extent, maybe we should also discuss definitions of the security guarantees or the security or the regime guarantee that the Kim Jong-un wants and the North Korean regime wants. And I'm not at the moment too sure what that could actually represent. Would it be the peace treaty or the arrangement? Would that be enough? Would it be withdrawal of the U.S. troops from the peninsula, or are there any shades of gray of that? So that would be one question. And if I can have a quick one for Ankit, you were talking about different definitions, dismantlement, disarmament, and so on. How about the switch from CBID to FVD, right? Do you see it as just a kind of semantics? Every administration, in South Korea, every president wants to have its own, so his or her own policy. So there's always new terminology. Or do you see that there is really a significant shift? And I also find interesting that the Europeans, they keep sticking to CBID, and the main reason we do is, I think, because it's in the UN resolutions, right? But do you think that would actually, there's any difference, and would it make sense to change that for the Europeans as well? Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Now, we have to be finished by 1 o'clock, and then we go to lunch. So, please answer.
I could make 3 short provocative comments. Firstly, the North Koreans have said to me that if necessary they're prepared to fight China. Back a few years ago, their interest was they wanted to pivot away from Beijing to Washington. Washington was too stupid to realize. And the result of that was the first summit with Xi, which was the signal that, well, there's no pivot. We're going to do it the old way. Secondly, we have a technological problem, because it used to be that the answer to security guarantees was you remove hardware and troops from South Korea. But the problem is these days, if the North is serious, and someone made the comment about you have to remove these things from areas where you threaten North Korea. I mean, you're talking, the last set of planes that came in to do mock attacks on Pyongyang came from Diego Garcia, the other side of the Indian Ocean. So there's going to be a big hole. And thirdly, and I don't like saying this under the view of the title of the conference, the North Koreans are interested in one system, two countries. I mean, that's the reality. They're introducing authoritarian capitalism, but they absolutely do not want unification, because as they say at the moment, early unification is assimilation. And that's not what we want. We want to be left on our own, and we can grow our economy at 10-15% a year, like South Korea did, like China did, and in 25 years' time, we can start talking unification. For the moment, it's two countries, one system.
Well, just to talk a bit about the security guarantees, it also depends who you, I mean, a peace treaty is far away from enough, but it also depends who you ask. When you speak to the Korean People's Army and some colonels and generals there, they have a much more, well, more realistic view on what is a security guarantee, what can be done. You look at the foreign ministry and people within the trade ministries, they have a very different and much more sort of more easy acceptable. So this is a question just different definition of different ministries. And I don't think there is a one definition that they will accept. I don't think the North Koreans really know what is sufficient at this moment. If there's a peace treaty, if there's a decent relations between the United States, there's a positive atmosphere between Kim and Trump, the demands will decrease. And if there's a poor relation, if China starts adding tension, they will increase, they will need more security guarantees. So this is a moving target. And that this is one of the things we actually need to sit down and talk. When military staff need to sit down and discuss practical issues, what is going on. And I think that the North Koreans need a bit of assistance in defining what is the security guarantees, what is sufficient, what is acceptable. But yeah, it depends on who you ask, and the KPA is far from ready to accept any security guarantees.
Okay, Professor Jang first, and then Kate next.
On the issue of North Korean denuclearization, it's apparent that the environmental science partners have different conceptions of denuclearization as well as political interest. And as far as I understand, the North Korean conception of denuclearization, they seem to think that the issue of denuclearization as a means to North Korea, they are making use of the issue of denuclearization as a position for possession of nuclear weapons. But to South Korean governments as well as to Americans, this denuclearization on the Korean Peninsula War of North Korea is a simple goal. But North Korea making use of it as a means. That's as far as I understand the issue. And underlying this kind of North Korean behavior, I think that basically they do not outspokenly taking this position, but basically they are challenging the legitimacy of the NPT system. Ordinary people and the North Korean elites may think in this way that why North Korean should not be permitted to have nuclear weapons. As a sovereign state, they may think in this way, we have a right to possess nuclear weapons, but the outside countries involving US and South Korea, they simply deny our right. They may think in this way. This is my understanding on the issue of the nuclearization.
I'll be brief. So first of all, Ambassador Tron, your point is very well taken. Of course, we had a working group devoted to the denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula concept. So I think using September 19, 2005 as sort of the gold standard for the post-degree framework, what can be accomplished with North Korea, I think is out. Of course, the difference now being that North Korea's leverage is significantly greater today than it was First, to be brief and provocative, I guess, like Clint, I would just say that I think there is really no security guarantee in the short term, and I guess I mean 5 to 10 years, that we can give North Korea that will be credible enough to replace what the North Koreans perceive that they get from their own nuclear weapons today. If we're lucky, after that period of time, things might change, but I think we need to have a very different kind of relationship with North Koreans. So that first, I take that first point of the Singapore statement quite seriously, that in order to unlock maybe a lot of these possibilities that we talk about, that Vladimir Putin has been talking about since his meeting with Kim Jong-un in Vladivostok, he's been very big on security guarantees, for security guarantees to be effective, and really, I think, supplant what North Korea perceives the benefit of its own nuclear weapons. Things really have to change in a serious way. On the CPID FNVD point, I think the big obvious difference is the omission of irreversibility. That's really the most difficult, given the complexity and size of North Korea's nuclear complex, fuel cycle, ballistic missile forces, which are more diverse and larger than ever. The irreversibility component is quite difficult. I think we've seen even with the dismantlement of the Bulgaria nuclear testing site and the dismantlement, which was then reversed, of the Sohae liquid propellant engine test stand last year, that very few things with regards to North Korea's programs are actually irreversible. So the final, I think, is an interesting addition to the FIPD formulation. I think the Trump administration's inclusion of that interesting word suggests that they intend to be the American administration to close the book on this problem once and for all. I don't think they'll be realized, fortunately, but those are just my thoughts on that difference. And yes, I completely agree that I think the Europeans continue to use it because that is the formulation that appears in the UN resolutions.
Okay, it's time to wrap up our second sessions. Thank you for all speakers and discussion in the floor. So let's get on.